Leading high-growth sales teams during periods of uncertainty and adversity is one of the toughest things that a sales leader has to do. Not only are there so many emotions that are riding high in our own organizations, but also with our clients as well. And so today, I'm super excited to be joined by one of my great friends in the sales world, Mr. Todd Caponi, author of The Transparent Sales Leader, to talk about different ways that we as sales leaders can help our team members navigate through these uncertain times. Welcome everyone to another episode of Sales Lab Live. I'm David Premer, and this is going to be a great episode today. I am super excited to be talking about one of my good friends in the sales world, Todd Caponi. Many of you know the author of The Transparency Sale and the soon-to-be published, and I'm sure soon-to-be bestseller, The Transparent Sales Leader. And we're going to be talking about this conversation around how to lead teams during times of adversity. And in a way, adversity, uncertainty, isn't that kind of all the time? Like life is never as clear sailing as we'd like it to be. And certainly in a post-pandemic world, we know anything can happen. But certainly when we have the kind of post-pandemic world, everything that's going on in the world, we have, economic uncertainty. Some companies are doing layoffs. And look, even at the best of times, many of our listeners here are kind of high growth B2B technology company sellers. There's ups and downs, all the time. And so uncertainty abounds. And so I'm super excited to get into this conversation with Todd and discuss things that we can do, I'd say, as sales leaders, but also as individual contributors to understand what we can do to kind of get through these tricky times. So without further ado, I'm going to add the illustrious Todd Caponi. Welcome, Todd. Good to see you, my friend.
What's up? How you doing?
Good. Hey, look, I'm super excited to be diving into this topic with you. And, maybe we'll just kind of start off because I know, we're both super big sales nerds and you're a big sales historian. And we were talking the other day and you were kind of telling me a little bit about kind of how what's going on in the world today is similar to how it was back in 1922, I think you said. Tell me a bit more about that.
Well, it was crazy because, like we had talked about, and for everybody else that doesn't know, like I'm just a nerd for the history of sales, right? Like those books are all like late 1800s, early 1900s on sales. When cool people are doing cool stuff on the weekend, like I'm sitting on the couch reading like a 1920 book of some sort. But here's what happened. I was reading a book from 1926, and it talked about this period, this 2-year period in 1921 and 1922, where the sales world experienced massively high levels of turnover involuntary, meaning, quote, sales leaders were practically purging their entire sales organizations. I was like, what happened? So I dug back and I realized that the 6 to 8 year period that led up to that looks spookily like the last 6 to 8 years. I mean, it's crazy. I'll give you the kind of the Cliff Notes version. Back then there was a period of extended steady growth, right? Like we haven't had a recession here. I'm in the US since 2008, right? Extended period of steady, slow growth, right? Pretty good. And then 1918, there was an event that shut off the economy for a short period of time, right? Like we in 2020 obviously experienced COVID, but back then the US was drawn into World War I and everybody stopped what they're doing, right? Like there was nothing. And oh, by the way, there also happened to be a pandemic called the Spanish flu, but the weird thing about that is no one seemed to care in any of my doc. Like there's no books about it was like it never happened. But economy shuts down. Short period of time. The US here, we were in World War I for a short period. We come out of it. Growth is exploding, right? Like companies can't hire salespeople fast enough. That sound familiar? Like sounds a lot like late 2020 and all of 2021, to the point where, the number of new unicorns based on valuations in 2021 was more than the 4 years previous from 2017 to 2020. So you think you'd see that as maybe a little bubble. But here's what happened next. Massive inflation spike. So early 1920, you experienced an inflation spike that was at 7%. And leaders at that time were calling that devastating. Now here in the US, last month it was 8.5%. It's been over 8% since early March. Yeah. And then, so during that period before that, though, through high growth, you had high salesperson turnover, but that was voluntary, just like the last 2 years. And you could call that the Great Resignation, right? That salespeople, even the crappy ones, were leaving companies and going for like trying to find more money. High inflation, bottom drops out, like literally dropped out to the point, like I said, 1921, 77% salesperson turnover, 1922, 85%, and that was involuntary. And so I started sounding the alarms back in January based on this, thinking, well, that's weird. And we can see that inflation's got to spike because of the supply demand issue for salespeople and just labor in general, that it always leads to inflation. But man, dude, like I looked at that and I'm like start batting down the hatches, something. I'm like, and here we are. So that's my nerdy sales history for today.
No, I love it. And look, you know what? We were talking about this. We both manage teams at, high growth companies that are kind of heterogeneous. You have some experienced sellers, you have some newer sellers. And one of the things that people sometimes freak out about, you're seeing this is like a cyclical thing. This happens, this is kind of normal, and it can happen in the best of times.
Yes.
But then sometimes you're managing or you're leading people for whom this is the first type of adversity they've encountered. And we need to be able to lead people through that. I'm curious, like what tips or insights do you have to kind of help people, as leaders help their team understand that this is kind of like normal. This happens from time to time and it's okay.
Yeah, and I mean, from a lot of the leaders, they've certainly never led through it, and maybe they're new to that they haven't been in the profession for that long, so maybe they've never experienced it. But let's start with one that you and I can riff on together, and it's the behavioral science of how uncertainty is a crazy maker for our brains. And like when you and I were doing this prep, I was telling you the story about if you're on death row in Japan, so like. You've been assigned to death. So you're in these cells. They don't tell you when it's coming, right? So every night when you go to bed, you don't know if tomorrow's the day or next week or next month. And so that's a crazy maker for our brains. Now, here's the amazing thing. So they're on death row. They're in their cells. Those death row inmates last year in 2021 filed a class action lawsuit calling that uncertainty inhumane. Right? Like they file it and they're like, that's inhumane. You've got to create certainty for us. Mm-hmm. Otherwise and the reason I bring that story up is that I see that today, right? It's not that as salespeople or in our sales profession, we're on death row, but your salespeople are looking around, seeing people getting laid off, and they're seeing stuff happen. They're seeing the economy constrict. They're seeing their own company spending shift. And as a result, they go to bed every night not knowing whether tomorrow is going to be the day. If you haven't given them any certainty at all, and as a result, they don't sleep as well. They don't perform as well. They're not as creative. Their IQ actually goes down when they're uncertain. And so tip number one for me, and I would love to get your take on this, David, as the behavioral science nerd that you are too, is seek ways to create certainty for your team. Right? Even if things are great, there's no way you can then embrace the things that you're uncertain about as a sales leader. So, hey, like, here's what we know. Here's what we don't know. And every Friday at 10 o'clock, we're all going to get on the phone together and we're going to do an update so that you at least have that to look forward to. But right now, if you're just silent on it, your team is going to bed uncertain. It's having a negative effect on their performance. I promise you. So tip number one, create certainty where certainty exists. Be transparent and embrace the things you're uncertain about, but create predictability around when the team should expect updates.
100%. And certainty is so important in selling as well. Like clients crave certainty, as a rep when the customer's not calling us back or they're ghosting on us, like we get all frantic, right? Like we crave certainty. And that's just the way our brains work. Our brains are always hardwired to look for, risks and doubt. And certainly that abounds. We're also kind of, we also crave certainty. We crave certainty by looking to our leaders and saying, like, well, what do you think? And I love the idea of like being transparent. I'll tell you, like the first startup that I was a part of, and we got acquired in 2007. So just kind of, we're going to talk about 2008 because 2008 was a tough time for lots of companies. But we got acquired. I was a young, sales director. Half my team, I had a team of about 20 people. Half were older than I was, half were younger than I was. And we got acquired, and it was a little bit of a shit show-ish acquisition, let's say. And the team was looking to me, right? Like, what's going to happen? And now I don't know. This is my first acquisition. I've never, never been through this before. And, I thought it was kind of my job to keep everyone happy and on the bus. And I'm like, hey, Todd, look, I think there could be good things ahead. I see this positive. I see that positive. And I remember a friend of mine who was a marketing director on the marketing team. So she was friends with my team. And she kind of came to me one day and she said, David, I just want you to know your team doesn't feel that you're being completely honest with them. Like they kind of feel like this is a bit of a shit show and you're trying to just put on like a happy face. And that was a big learning for me. Like people do want to know what you think. You don't have to like gush. It's like you're going into war and you're the sergeant and like you don't have to tell everyone you're super afraid and oh my gosh, what's going to happen. But a little bit of transparency, right, goes a long way. And it doesn't even have to be like an acquisition. It could be like an acquisition rumor. I remember back at Salesforce, it was like Microsoft could acquire us and like and everyone's, kind of buzzing. Look at what's happening now with Elon Musk and Twitter. And sometimes I saw this article about the employees at Twitter were talking to the CEO and saying, hey, look, we don't think you're being honest with us about what's going on. So, so I think there's a certain amount of transparency that's very important. I guess the question for you is like, where do you draw the line between, oversharing and maybe scaring people and embracing the uncertainty? Like, what's your advice for leaders on that front?
Well, yeah, I think let's take the advice or the wisdom of a supermodel because, like, why wouldn't we?
Some of the brightest people, right? Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I'll tell you, dude. Tyra Banks. So Tyra Banks, supermodel, media mogul, business mogul. She coined a term called flossom, right? And flossom means to embrace your flaws, but know that you're still awesome. Mm-hmm. And what's meant by that is, to your point, like if you don't know anything, like who wants to run behind somebody who's just like, I don't know anything, right? Like that, you cease to become a leader. But if you also, on the other hand, like you said, if you pretend that everything's perfect and there's nothing going on, it's kind of like that meme where the dog is drinking his coffee and the rest of the building is on fire. That's ridiculous too. And so I think it comes down to, like, again, you need to be a leader. Embrace the things that you know and that you're strong and you're confident about, but also embrace those things that you don't know, where you're unsure, and then what your path is going to be to solve that. I mean, March of 2020, no one had ever experienced anything like that in the history of the world. And so there was no way for any leaders to be certain. But the best ones were the ones that were like, hey, listen, what we can see right now, especially like in the tech space, is that like everybody's home. We're going to like investments are going to be made. The economy is not going to shut down for long, but here's what we don't know. We don't know how that's going to impact us, what that means for our team, what that means for our cash flow. Here's what our CEO is doing right now. He's doing X, Y, Z, and then she's doing X, Y, and Z. And here's our plan to figure this out. That's strong, that's confident, but that's not pretending everything's, cupcakes and rainbows. And it's not pretending that everything's, that you know everything. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the balance. Again, it always, like, that word flossom really struck me because it's like, flossom is what, like, on that, you and I have talked about this before, but like my first book is based on this idea that people buy slower when they're on a website and every review is perfect, right? Like when everything's a 5-star review, people cease to buy. That actually optimal purchase conversion happens when a product is between a 4.2 and a 4.5 on average. And like, why? Because the product's flossom, but it also has to do with that certainty that we at a subconscious level know that perfection doesn't exist. And as a result, until we're able to assess the squeeze, we will never know whether the juice is going to be worth the squeeze. And that's exactly the type of way that we need to be thinking as leaders right now, is it's not all perfect. Embrace what you know. Embrace what you don't know, but create a plan. Anything you can do to create certainty for your team right now is going to pay off in huge dividends.
I love it. And 100%, I think the plan part, and I'm so glad you kept talking about that, is so important because it's one thing to kind of be in an uncertain situation and feel helpless. But then when at least you're doing something, like I remember, when we were acquired from Salesforce, my company, and then we were kind of running as our own kind of separate business in Salesforce for a couple of years. The good news is, like, we hit our number, both of those years before we transitioned to the core, but there was a lot of uncertainty, like just getting deals done in this new environment. And it was kind of after that first year where we kind of pushed through the uncertainty and we kind of hit the number, that we got to the start of the second year. And of course, the expectations go up. And, I said to the team, I'm like, look, you know what? The number's big. I know the number's big and scary. We got to it last year. We had a plan. We executed on the plan. I can't tell you 100% that, it's in the bag, but we have a plan. We have a system. Let's follow it. And just having that little bit of certainty, even I'll give you like an example from my personal life. I talk about this in my book, but a number of years ago, I was diagnosed with cancer. And I remember it was like a few days before my surgery I was supposed to have. And the nurse or whoever in the operating room, they actually don't tell you like when your operating time is or the exact, logistics. They kind of call you before. So she calls me like a few days before. She says, okay, your operating time is this. And I was like so excited, right? Like
Yeah.
and she's like, I've never met anyone who's like so excited to be going into like cancer surgery. And I was like, well, look, like you live with this thing and you just want it out and done and finished. And even if it's, the journey is still longer, now I feel like I'm doing something. And when you're not doing something, when you're waiting around, that feeling of helplessness, we've all been there. You go for some kind of test and you're waiting for the result. Maybe it's you want to get into medical school, or maybe it's a medical test or a scan, and not knowing the uncertainty, you create this whole narrative in your head, and your brain, trying to keep you safe, what it tries to do is it tries to make up these horrific bad things that could potentially happen that are not necessarily rooted in reality, because it's trying to brace you for like, oh, what happens when the economy crashes? What happens if I lose my job? And now make no mistake that having the plan and doing things and being at least, I'd say proactive makes you feel better. But not knowing and not having anything in place is bad. And it's a huge, let's bring it back to the world of sales for a second. Not having that in place is a huge distraction for your team. If they see something coming and they feel like you're not being honest or not even talking about it, it's a massive distraction. And even if it's not real, it's like, my daughter, when she was younger, and she would say, oh, Daddy, there's a monster in my closet. It's going to come out and eat me in the middle of the night. And I know it's, 90% chance that's not going to happen. But in her mind, it's real, right? Yeah. And so in the mind of our team members, they feel like this uncertainty, however real or not real, is a big deal. So I love this idea of having a plan.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you need any evidence that uncertainty drives us crazy, go back to March of 2020 and check out your local Costco and look at the carts coming out that are stocked with 2-ply, 5 deep, right? Like, we do crazy things. Our brain does not work the way it should. And it's, again, and I think it leads into this second piece of advice for sales leaders right now. If you're ready, I'll dive into my thoughts on this.
Yeah.
And again, it's nerdy, like you and I, brother, is this idea of empathy, meaning for anybody who's listening to this, like, what do you do when you are facing a personal recession in your life, right? Meaning, like, even right now, you might be looking at, gosh, my variable comp isn't going to look as good over the next 6 months, or my job is in peril, or whatever it happens to be. When you face a personal recession, there's 3 things that you do. Number 1 is you probably cut off or at least delay any discretionary spending, right? Like, do I really need that personal trainer? Like, the new couch, yeah, my cat scratched it up, but we can wait. I don't need a new car right now. Like, we take the discretionary and we go, all right, let's put that aside. Second thing we do is, all right, for the things that we absolutely need, what are we going to do? We're going to try to get our costs down on those, right? And so that could be, instead of going and buying a gallon of milk at Whole Foods or whatever, I'm going to go to Aldi and I'm going to save $3 a gallon, right? That's $3. Instead of buying gas here, I'm going to drive another 3 blocks and save 10 cents a gallon. Like, that's what our brain does. And it's 10 cents a gallon, but it's worth the 2 blocks when things are tight. And then the third thing we do is, when there's uncertainty, we look to extend our runway. And that example is like the toilet paper or any of those types of things. We go, all right, how do we make sure that we've got enough to get through this? Now, when we think about that, I was with a partner at a private equity firm last week, and I was kind of sharing this stuff. And he's like, yep. Number 1 is they told all of their portfolio companies to shut off the discretionary. They also told all of their companies to try to find 20 to 30% on all existing spend. And then number 3, they said, get to a cash runway of 18 months right now. Like, oh, that's what we do. That's what companies do. The people you're selling to, they all happen to be human beings. They're doing this in their personal lives and in their businesses. So what does that mean for you? Well, it means a couple of things. Number one is if your messaging or your positioning sounds discretionary or nice to have at all right now, find it, hit select all, and then hit delete, right? And then go, all right, from the lens of June of 2022, what is our messaging? What is our value proposition? Change all of it right now. Get your marketing team out and go freaking bang on that. Because again, if it sounds discretionary, it is going either away or off to the side. It probably already has. So that's kind of tip number 2 is think through the lens of your own personal recessions. Eliminate discretionary, cut costs on the things you need, and extend your runway. How does your positioning, your messaging adhere to that?
100%. And you know what, the way I kind of think about it, back at the beginning of the pandemic, when everyone's like in kind of full lockdown, I say like personal, but also business lockdown mode, you started watching like even just commercials on TV. And the commercials that were running were the commercials that were kind of filmed prior to COVID. And so you would watch them and you're like, okay, like this seems like a little tone deaf because now we're in this, And then what happened was all the marketing kind of changed, and now it was like soft piano music, and we're all in this together. But then like that only lasted for a certain amount of time, and then it was like a different brand of pandemic messaging. And when you saw, brands that were still going out with the soft piano music, you were like, are you not even paying attention to kind of what's going on? So nailing your messaging and not just being that nice to have, but creating the certainty in the mind of your customer about how this is going to be aligned with your priorities now is really, really important. And also not being kind of tone deaf, with respect to what's going on in the world. And when we spoke the last time, you used this term, I wrote this down, extreme firmographic focus.
Well, that's number 3. So that's tip number 3. But we'll get to, to your point, like from a B2B perspective, like back in March of 22, one of my clients, it's a company called Envoy. You might know them. They're the company that, like, when you go and you check in into an office, there's a little iPad and you go, I'm here to see David. And it might take my picture, create a little badge for me, but then it notifies you that I'm there. Well, 2 weeks after everybody was home, their homepage was still talking about that as their value prop. And all of a sudden, I was talking to them about this whole idea. I'm not taking credit for what they did, but they brilliantly shifted to the point where they realized that their technology had a big play on all these offices and environments where they were still having to receive shipments. There were still individuals that had to go deliver this stuff. And how do we create extremely safe work environments for those visits that still need to happen? They changed their website. They had a cartoon on their website that they put masks on all the people. It was brilliant. And they went, they were on a steady growth. They dipped and then went even higher, right? And it was just, again, have empathy for what is going on in the minds of your buyers. Hit select all, delete on your messaging right now and rework it from the lens of June 2022.
100%. Like this idea of, I talk about, well, what is it your customer values? Meaning people buy feelings 100% of the time. And so what are the feelings that they're buying when they buy you? And the feelings that they're buying now may not be the same feelings they were buying, like a year or two ago. And so you always have to make sure you're aligning. And by the way, those feelings can be different depending on who within your customer's organization you're selling to. So selling to a frontline manager versus CFO, again, could be a different permutation of messaging. So don't fall in love with any of this stuff, right? You always have to be iterating, especially in times like these.
Exactly. Then you brought up extreme firmographic focus. I like to call that the third one. I've got like 10, like you and I could nerd out all day. But what I mean by that is, I've seen, and I used to do this as a leader too, like the tougher things got, the wider net we would cast, right? Like, hey, let's call on everybody. Like, let's just try to reel in everything. It's like, that you're going hunting and there's a bunch of birds in a field and you're just like, let's fire this thing off. And like, no, that's insane. And so when times get tough, I'm a huge advocate for the power of what I call extreme firmographic focus, which means I want you to think about 2 things. Number one, the companies that you sell to where there's plenty, their average, the deal sizes are solid, your win rates are good, your cycle lengths are good, right? So quantity, dollar amount, win rate, and cycle lengths. Like look at those ratios and go, all right, what are the verticals on those? And then pick a couple of verticals to go really, really deep on, because you know that your solution, your messaging really adheres to that. And then number two, that goes right along with it, is to prioritize your verticals based on those verticals that do well in economic downturns, because there are some that do really well. Healthcare, pharma, there's certain lines of CPG. Everybody still needs their toilet paper, right? Like that's all not going away. And so what we do, and so that's what I did in 2008, is I was the SVP of sales for a company called Right Hemisphere. We were struggling. And I just, being the nerd that I've always been, I was like, hey, we just closed an aerospace company. They need us right now. Like aerospace is not going away. Travel is not going away. And there's a solution here that is highly differentiated in the market and has a big impact on, time to market and revenue. Hey, for the next 4 weeks, all the reps, all I want you to focus on is aerospace and defense. Like that's it, right? Or our solution could adhere to any discrete manufacturer, but for that 4 weeks, and what we're going to do is our marketing team is going to illuminate all of our case studies for aerospace and defense. And we're going to, every day, we're going to get on the phone, we're going to teach you something about it. We've hired an outside consultant who is a 30-year veteran in the aerospace and defense industry, who's going to be your partner, but he's going to spend a bunch of time with you, educating you on this. We're going to pull in our customers, and what they're going to do is they promise to share what their priorities are, what they read, what they care about, and even open their email inbox and show us what stands out and what doesn't, right? And then like how they're measured and that sort of thing. We're going to become experts on aerospace and defense. And while everybody else was zagging, we went right towards 400% year-over-year growth by closing Boeing, Cessna, Gulfstream, Northrop Grumman, and then we slowly went out from there. Like my Houston rep was like, hey, oil and gas looks a lot like that. I'm like, all right, go. And we'll do the same thing for you, because now we've got money again. Like we're almost out. We'll hire a consultant just for you. And he closed Schlumberger and Halliburton. My Chicago guy was like heavy manufacturing and automotive. All right, cool. We went out and we got Deere, we got Caterpillar, we got Chrysler. And all of a sudden we went from struggling and all over the place through, and I can't remember the word for it. I write about it in the new book, but it's like it's not Bernie Madoff, but it's like Bader-Madoff syndrome or whatever. It's that thing where once you see a word or some concept, you start seeing it everywhere. Do you remember what that's called?
I don't, but I know what you mean.
Yeah, and that's what happened with my team, that all of a sudden they became aerospace experts and defense experts. Their clients felt it, right? Confidence is contagious. They would go in and they were the ones, my reps are not aerospace experts. They're going in and talking to a VP of manufacturing at Boeing and teaching that individual, right? About, hey, listen, you're trying to get 787s out the door. You've got a assembly line issue based on what I'm seeing on CNBC. And like, here's a potential solution. We can do it. There's other solutions too, but here's a way to think about it. And all of a sudden that what was normally a $200,000 deal became a $7 million deal. Extreme firmographic focus. I'm telling you, don't cast a wider net. Go tighter, build that confidence in your team. And like, dude, that's with my advisory clients, I've been telling them that in good times and bad, right? Like one of them sells to e-commerce and retail, and they were struggling, but out of their first 5 customers, 3 were selling shoes. And I was like, all right, go sell shoes. Screw the rest of your list. For the next 4 weeks, shoes. And all of a sudden they're getting Echo and Cole Haan, and like they're starting to kill it. And they just are taking a Series B now, and they're surviving. So anyway, that's my firmographic focus rant for today.
Well, look, I think that's great advice, even for the best of times, because what you just described, really knowing your customer to the point where you can walk in and with that conviction, because I say, people are buying feelings 100% of the time. And, this concept I talk about, the experience is the product. And so if you're talking to a sales rep and they seem newer, insecure, or tentative, then you're like, I'm going to pay you a lot of money for this solution, then I don't really feel comfortable making that investment. But if you have that confidence and conviction, part of it is arming people with the right words, which is what the firmographic focus does. So if we say, hey, look, we're going to attack these kinds of customers with this kind of messaging, that's step one. Step two is to practice it in a way that feels very human, that you can deliver with high conviction because you've repeated it. It's so like commonsensical in your head. You've been in the minds of your customer, especially if you're newer or younger in your sales career. Really important to nail that. And that's like great advice, even at the best of times. But 100%, this idea of like selling during adversity. So at the beginning of the pandemic, I wrote this article, which I've kind of continued to refresh. And amazingly, if you just Google selling during adversity, like Google it, it's like the first article that comes up. And one of the things I talk about is this idea, exactly what you said, is like focus on the customers that you can help now. Because if you're calling on customers with no money, like think about at the beginning of the pandemic trying to sell to an airline or hospitality industry. I mean, that's a tough slog. And it's not that I want to give up on you, but I don't think I can help you now, and I don't have the tools and messaging to help you. So I'm going to go focus over here for the time being. And that's always, a good call. The other piece is like if you have long-term relationships with customers who are in a bad situation now, is to just, remember that, how we treat people, and this goes for, I'm going to say this for customers, but just people in general. When you're going through, now I'm like speaking softly. When you're going through,
Can I play some music? Yeah.
When you're going, like you play the piano. When you're going through like a tough time, in business, you always remember how people treated you during that time. And it's actually, I love, Simon Sinek talks about it in his book, Leaders Eat Last. Like it's actually a physiological thing where it's like, or it's a biochemical thing where in times of adversity, it's like your brain's hitting the recording button, because what it's trying to do is it's trying to remember the sequence of steps that are happening in like slow motion real time, so that if you ever find yourself in that period of adversity again, you know what to do to get out of it. That's why we always remember like the worst times in our life, and not like the times when everything was, went great. And so it's the same thing for us now. Your employees, your team members will remember how you treated them. If you were kind, if you were empathetic, if you had, if you had a plan, if you recognized and were transparent, they will remember that. And your customers as well, beginning of the pandemic or now, like if you have customers that are in a tough position, and maybe they're asking for different payment terms or, like a little bit of flexibility to get them through the rough spot, and you have this relationship with them, they will, not only is it important to be kind and empathetic, but they will remember biochemically how you treated them during this time. So it's really important to get it right during times of uncertainty.
Great point. Yeah, I love that. And to your point, our brains are prediction machines, right? Like I believe that in my new book, The Transparent Sales Leader, I kind of start with that idea that the most important job for a revenue leader is to help your sellers predict, right? And help them predict what's coming, not only macro level, but even at a micro level. So much of what we do as salespeople, there's stress involved with that. Making a cold call, having to negotiate with a procurement head at a big company, doing a presentation in front of 50 people. Like there's a lot of anxiety associated with that. And part of your role is to help them predict. And there's no better time to help them predict than right now, right? Like this is when, and like you probably can't see this. It's a very complicated chart here that I was just kind of noodling on, but it's this idea that as sales become harder to get, the importance of optimized sales leadership goes up, right? And that's like, of course, but gosh, when things are, cotton candy and rainbows, a sales leader's role is not the same as it is when things are tough. Like now is the time you got to step up. And there's a quote here, and I'm going to read it. It's from 1925. It's from Sales Management magazine. And it says, skillful sales direction is more needful than ever. The time when anyone with something to sell can sell it is passing and passing rapidly. And that's 1925, and it's also 2022. So like, like now it's the time to optimize.
Well, I think, it probably makes sense to end how we began with some 1920s sales history, but this was awesome. Will you come back? We got to do this again. We could go on for hours talking about all sorts of stuff, I'm sure.
Yeah, you and I have joked about being like brothers from another sales mother. Like
Absolutely.
We think a lot alike, and it's just so fun to riff on this. And I learn something every time I listen to you. So this is awesome.
Oh, my pleasure. Well, look, if you're listening here, go pick up The Transparent Sales Leader, when it's available. When's it coming out? In July?
We were commiserating on printing, but paperback and short run and the Kindle will come out July 5th, and we'll do a full launch the end of August.
Yeah, we were saying, books are a tough time. We're doing another print run of my book as well, and it's just mayhem. You can't get paper. You can't. It's
Yeah.
like it's bonkers out there.
Everything's
But
backed up. It's nuts. Yeah.
all good. Well, look, it is a pleasure having you here, my man. Thank you so much, and I hope everyone got something out of this. Looking forward to talking more about these kind of timely topics to make sure that we're giving you the tools you need to succeed in today's environment. But with that, we will shut it off. Thank you for joining another episode of Sales Lab Live. Thank you so much to Todd Caponi, and we will see you next time.